Beautiful Acapulco. Hey, folks, this is an interview that I just got done doing with Kent Dahlgren and Bob Podolsky in regard to a culture of constant improvement and organizing. And I think it is incredibly valuable, especially for people that are business people, people that are entrepreneurs, people that are activists, people that are fed up and outraged at things that are going on around the world or in their particular community. This is the stuff that really can, I think, simplify it and make it happen. And it certainly relates to the stuff I'm doing with my ethical emergence courses and the local Dynamo project. So I think it's extremely valuable. Definitely take the time to take a look. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's go ahead and begin the interview. Today we've got a couple special guests, a couple guests that have we've seen before. Today we're going to be talking about really the need for organization and a culture of constant improvement. And it's something that I feel is really important, and I think these two gentlemen think is very important, and I think we've got a couple different solutions to discuss. But in general, we're going to be talking about a couple videos that I highlighted that talk about developing what is called lean management. And in particular, somebody that was talking about Toyota as an organization and what they call their Kata. And it's effectively a culture of constant improvement. And I think this is really a something that we need to embody as a community. And so I'll begin by simply asking both of you to answer in your own terms. What is the Toyota model, and what does it mean to you in regard to that culture of constant improvement? So, Bob, you want to kick it off?
I can do that. Well, I have not studied the Toyota culture specifically, but I have spent quite a bit of time studying its antecedents, the Deming model of management. William Edwards Deming originally presented his management model as simply a more rational way of managing industrial processes. He called it statistical management, where basically you actually measure the processes and the outcomes and make mathematical decisions about changes that should be made. And out of that model came the thing called total quality management, or TQM, which is, I believe, the basis for Toyota's management of their business and probably all of the other major manufacturers in Japan and subsequently other parts of the world who've adopted the same system. So it was a big, big improvement in management when this new system began to be practiced. And it transformed the industry of Japan in a period of about 15 years from a really bad system into a really good system. Unfortunately, the government of Japan did not adopt the same model. It's too bad because they've had some serious problems there without it. But it turns out that if you examine the principles, the underlying principles that Deming introduced into Japanese industry, what you see on examining it closely is that the method that he proposed, although he never mentioned it, actually hinges on an improvement of ethical standards. That it turns out that if you were to, and I've demonstrated this, that if you have a system of management or organization more generally that is highly ethical, all of Deming's suggestions to the Japanese industry follow as logical consequences of the improved ethics. And I don't know whether Deming had in mind improving the ethics of Japanese industry or not, but that was the effect, that Japanese industries became not very much more ethical, but somewhat more ethical. And that little change in their ethics made a vast difference in their success. So when I think about the continuous improvement or total quality management paradigm, I always think about it in terms of the ethics. How have the ethics of the participants in that industry changed? And when you track it, when you look closely at those details, it's very evident that when a group of people in industry or elsewhere for that matter decides we're going to maximize truth, awareness, creativity, and love, you wind up with vastly better results. And the Deming work that led to total quality management is just an example of that. It is a subset of the logical consequences of a better set of ethics. Does that satisfy as an introductory description?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you. Kent, how about you?
Well, my introduction to, actually, I just want to acknowledge the work that Bob has done to map total quality management to an ethics model is really brilliant, actually. Because in contemporary terms, there are people who are talking about how we can use modern technologies to gamify our self-created societies. And wouldn't it be cool to gamify or provide reward incentives for people to align to not just a model that actually helps them improve their performance and community competitiveness or whatever metaphor they want to use, but it also aligns to an ethical model, which I think is fantastic. Perhaps ironically, my introduction to total quality management was through the military, right? And so I was still in the service, and we went through a training to learn TQM, and found it intriguing. But it's an example of the difference between theory and application, right? Because I'm in the military, which is very command and control, very top down, and we're learning about the benefits of TQM. And I remember sitting and going, I don't know how we're going to implement this. I can't even figure out how this is going to happen, right? I mean, I really dig that we're in this training. Thanks for that, because now we don't have to do work. We can sit here. That's cool. How is this going to work here? Because by my observation, those that are in the military are promoted based on how long they've been sitting in that chair, right? So it's like, and not to be irreverent, but come on, right? So, but anyway, so then I left the military and I went into manufacturing. I worked at a company called Techtronics, which is a really great technical environment. And then later I worked at Xerox. And in that context, I became Lean and Six Sigma certified. And that was interesting because then I actually saw, I would say on a scale from 0 to 10, I saw, I would say in the military, we did maybe a 0.5 adoption of the TQM principles. And I would say that within the context of Techtronics and Xerox, I'd say maybe we were a 3 to 4 on that spectrum versus say a 10, still it was interesting. So, I'll make just a simple observation and then pause so we can continue the discussion. But, when I started at Xerox, there were 80,000 employees. And then when I left, they'd lost 20,000 and we'd actually become more productive. And what helped that happen is that we had used the statistical process controls or the statistical management principles to make decisions about what constituted the most efficient and effective examples of organizational governance, if you will, right? What are the trade-offs that we needed to make in order to achieve our objectives in the context of essentially economic duress, which is a fascinating scenario, right? Because it might be really similar to what communities go through. I really like listening to Michael because he really provides a great historical context for what we're going through. And I can see a scenario where many communities might start experiencing, what we could call economic duress, which might be a byproduct of tax revolt, for instance. Maybe people get tired of paying taxes to fund one scandal after another, and they start engaging in ways to avoid taxes versus evade them, right? It's legal, but they're doing tax avoidance, and it creates an economic crisis, and the government has to actually make difficult decisions, saying all things being equal, what constitutes the most efficient and effective resources to meet community needs? And just like that, they're right back to what, the scenario we went through at Xerox. Like, how do we continue to grow while basically trimming the fat, which is those are tough decisions. And the statistical process controls that were provided with Six Sigma and the processes that were with Lean enabled us to make those very difficult decisions. And frequently those decisions ran counter to senior management. In fact, that got me into no small amount of hot water more than once. But I would say, well, I mean, what exactly is my responsibility? Because it says right here that I'm supposed to do this, and it sounds like you're saying that it ran counter to your directive, which doesn't make any sense because that's my directive, right? So anyway, that's what I'll say on this right now, and then I'll pause and let Michael continue the discussion.
Yeah, well, I think you both hit on very good points. I'll say myself that in my situation, kind of coming out in the construction industry and then having some success at implementing, effectively some computerized methodology towards, improving the process of doing construction, but then actually learning about lean management and really getting an opportunity to learn about Deming and so forth. I was able to really see how this really works, and then to carry it out. And being that I was a project superintendent, I had the authority to make the decisions and so forth. I was able to really implement this to a great degree, and of course it increased productivity tremendously, but it also increased the morale. The people started to actually start to believe in themselves, start to really enjoy coming to work and so forth. And it meant a lot of different things, and of course it built a community. A construction project is kind of like a community, and typically it's a very dysfunctional community. But in these cases, as I went through different experiences and different projects, I was able to hit on it every single time and make a significant difference. And so one of the things that is really pointed out in regard to people talking about lean and implementing lean is that you got to change people's thinking, and they've got to actually become more scientific or critical in their thinking process, and even potentially becoming entrepreneurial in regard to seeing what the problems are and then being able to devise solutions, but then being able to work together. So
Horshack has a question or a comment.
Talk to that.
So I ran Scrum teams, engineering teams, right? And I did this for a very long time. And when I first started doing it, what I would have is a very large engineering team, which would a software engineering team. And software is interesting because imagine, okay, so what's interesting about software is you can't just write a functional capability, right? You have to assume there's attrition. And even though everybody that's on the engineering team has learned the same programming language, there are as many different ways to solve a problem as there are people that are on the engineering team. Because in effect, it's an authoring language. It's almost more accurate to assume that the people that are on the software team are writing a novel, a fiction, if you will, work of fiction. And it's not a single author, it's multiple contributors. So if you think of it in those terms, what you're creating is a team of writers, of authors, and all of them are contributing to an evolving work of fiction, and there's a certain style to it. And if you lose all of the engineers, the people that come in will say, I don't understand what this story is about, and they end up breaking the continuity. That's actually one of the biggest reasons that software dies, is they lose that continuity. So when I would work within these monolithic large teams that were very centralized, the continuity was awful. Their ability to deliver in a deterministic manner, in a predictable manner, was abysmal, and the efficiencies were awful. So they were late and over budget pretty much every time. So there have been some enhancements to software development best practices, generally referred to as the Scrum Agile methodology, and I'm actually a pretty big fan of that. And so what I ended up doing is you end up creating and running small, discrete teams that have a specific problem space. And so, and what I mean by that is, you know, at least 2 to 3 and no more than 7. At 7, you hit diminishing returns. And they are responsible for a particular problem space. And what I had some success doing is organizing a number of those teams into technically profit centers. And now there's some nuance there, and that might not be evident to those who don't run businesses. Most businesses are cost centers, which means that all they do is they represent a bottom line cost of the organization, not actually bringing money back. But if you organize the groups as a profit center, what you're doing is making it so every member of that team is able to say, I helped this happen. So one of the things that I did with a VP of engineering is we did the co-pilot program, where the engineering team would work directly with sales to make sure that every deployment worked, no matter how big it was. And what was cool about that is that these engineers were helping bring in new business. And so at the end of each quarter, they could say, I did that. I did that. I helped that happen. That helps with morale, similar to what Michael's talking about. Now, they don't think of themselves as a cog in the machine. They're part of bringing business in the door. They're part of the solution, right? But it also puts them in a position where they can say, this isn't efficient or effective. And that's where some of these practices that Michael's talking about within, you know, Lean or Six Sigma or whatever, it actually empowers them to make some really difficult decisions and say, this is not the best decision. This is not the best thing that we could do. In the context of us bringing value, which is either bringing new resources or saving resources, this is a more efficient or effective way. And what it does, it helps with morale, it helps with attrition, it helps with efficiency, it helps with deterministic execution. In all ways, it's a good thing. And what it does is it creates that sense of ownership and stewardship at the base level. So I have had a lot of success with that.
Bob, do you get anything?
Yeah, I think that that's really good thinking. In my own experience, in the years that I worked in industry and in government, I never had the experience of seeing that what I was doing contributed to someone else's life, where someone actually personally benefited from what I was doing. That doesn't mean that it didn't happen. It just means it was invisible. If it happened, it was invisible to me because of the way the organizations were run. And that was a big detractor from my morale. And so, Kent, what I hear you saying about the advantage of that, I think it's right on. I've met a lot of people who would not become entrepreneurs because they didn't want the responsibility. But they seemed to be oblivious to the fact that they weren't getting the rewards for their own productivity.
That's right.
Other people were getting all the rewards, and they were just warming a chair, obeying what they were told,
Dude.
And not feeling like they had any ownership.
Dude, you just hit on exactly why people didn't go from 0 to 10 on the TQM spectrum, right? Because
Right.
There's people that are in chairs that are essentially superfluous, and they take the credit on behalf of others. That's the part.
Yes. So that was a big deal when I figured that out, and actually went into business for myself, changed my field, and went into business for myself, and my whole life, everything about my life got better almost overnight. So I see that that's a really central piece, and it has to do with the ethics again. That in a setting or an organization where you actually are aware that you're making great things happen, in that setting, morale is good. People don't come and go much; they tend to stay. You don't have a lot of turnover and all the expense that goes with personnel turnover. Lots of benefits come out of having people treating each other better and better communication and more entrepreneurial attitude. Right. I can't tell you how many people I've interviewed in business who said, oh gosh, how am I going to ever get employees who treat the business like it's their own? Well, it's not their own. They don't get to spend the profits. They go on a vacation, 100 miles from home, and the owners of the business travel all over the world having wonderful experiences.
That's totally been my observation, is that there's an executive caste, I would call them, not a class, but an executive caste
Yes.
who uses the language of accountability and action, but corrupts it through their own inaction and unaccountability. So,
Yeah.
if you think about, if you can distill a team, the teams that I would work in would be companies of, 150, $300 million. And really, that's all dependent on a small number of pretty well self-contained groups, right? And if you create them into profit centers, you're a step away from creating separate corporate entities. If you think about it, you could technically pull that off. If I have an engineering team that's building a certain part of software, and they're able to show that every quarter they save or make the organization more than what they actually cost, technically they could run as their own business.
Yes.
And I think the executive class knows that, right? So, I have a feeling that if you could make that one additional step, you've essentially eviscerated a superfluous, unnecessary, and wasteful caste of those who take the credit of others, but really aren't necessary. And they'll be forced to go out and do work for the first time in their career.
Kent, I actually have a model for that.
I'd love to see it.
I call it SPS. Instead of TQM, it's SPS, or socio-polycentric stewardship.
I like it.
It's a model that is based on the ethics and that actually solves the problem that you were just describing. And I'd love to launch it into the world, because I think that it has the potential to displace TQM with a better model. It's like the next generation of what started out to be TQM.
I think Deming would agree. He would approve, right? Like, why it's not religion? Why not improve it?
Well, yeah, there you go.
Well, certainly we're talking to a community of people, and effectively what I'm trying to suggest is that most people are completely unaware of really all of this, how to organize, how to get things done. And they have a model that is essentially the hierarchical model of how they think businesses operate and so forth.
Right.
But if you look at the experience of many entrepreneurs and many businesses, and even in the crypto world, many of the enterprises and projects that have gone out there, and how in most cases they've failed incredibly, or people have invested in ideas thinking that it's going to work out, and saw them crash and burn in so many cases. I mean, it's one of the problems with like crypto these days is we've got all these crypto projects out there, and most of them are would be considered shit coins. They're bullshit. They're just scams that people fall victim to, and they can't tell the difference between a good organization and a bad organization, even when they're involved in an organization. They as long as they're getting paid, they think, okay, well, I'm doing a job, and I'm getting, I'm producing value and I'm getting paid for it. But the reality is they're not actually doing that, because the whole money system is corrupted. And so yeah, they'll pay them to twiddle their thumbs on the side of the road to build a bridge or something that costs 10 times as much as it should. Right. But because the government has okayed it, and because the corporations have scammed the thing, that's what they get paid for. But the reality is that there's so much more value that's out there that people are completely oblivious to, because they haven't been taught how to figure out what's valuable and what's harmful.
Well, I think so. That's the thing.
Really kind of introducing this process of critical thinking is a necessity for a community moving forward towards having a understanding of why ethical conduct is a good thing. And certainly to have it in a community where people are trying to be ethical and trying to do the right things is probably a great place to get started with that.
Well, so when I worked at Techtronics, which builds oscilloscopes, right? So I worked in the military and I played with oscilloscopes, and suddenly I got to work for them, and I was very excited about it. I felt very passionate about it. So I hadn't been there very long, and I developed some passions about things we could do that would help the business. And my boss would say, well, we don't have the available money. And I'd say, what are you talking about? This company makes, I mean, we just crossed the $1 billion threshold, right? So of course we got money. And what he taught me was something important, is that the good news is the money's there. The bad news is it's being spent elsewhere. And so he introduced a model that was really, really good, actually. And it's one that I use within my organization, is he would, every quarter, every 3 months, we needed to show that we had made or saved the organization at least as much as what we cost. And it wasn't like he'd fire us if we didn't. It was a coaching exercise, right? And so in order to know that, we had to work with finance. And what finance would teach us is something called burden rate, which is not just what my payroll is, but it's my payroll plus taxes, plus insurance, plus my share of the infrastructural cost, right? So if I were making, $100,000 a year, my burden rate was somewhere closer to, maybe 170,000 all told. And then that would be broken into hours. It actually creates a very baseline measurement. And I could say, all things being equal, this is my contribution, right? And from there, then I had a way of saying, okay, well, that's who I am in terms of numbers within the organization. And then from there, I learned that there's different things. You could work to make more money, like to get more sales, or in manufacturing, it's fascinating. I have a friend named Travis who works in manufacturing, and he just figured out how to save 90 cents per washer on a manufacturing process, which doesn't sound like much, but dude, they use millions and millions of washers. So he just saved them huge amounts of money, right? Every time they got to use that washer, they've just saved 90 cents, and it saves, right? So that taught me a lot about that. You can spend your time to make more money, or you can spend your time to make this process more efficient. And that unlocks what's called opportunity cost, which is costs that would have been allocated there previously, but you've made a case for actually eliminating it and having it spent somewhere else. It's essentially like finding a pocket of resources and unlocking it so it comes out. So this is the thing where I learned a lot about what is like an A/B test. Like, okay, well, let's compare, right? Let's do a test. This is the A test, and this is the outcome. And the B is the current state. And in that context, you can quickly show that a lot of organizational management is actually trapped opportunity cost. It's actually what's inhibiting the machine from working in a more efficient and effective manner. And so, at Xerox, we shed 20,000 jobs and became more efficient and effective, and most of them were management, right? So it is with government, for what it's worth, right? But the people have to end up taking that on. They end up having to do some self-governance. They might have to handle things that are on their own. And they might realize that there's a lot more money out there than they thought. That money doesn't have to be spent in the way that they thought, right?
Yeah, let me jump in on that. I think that there is a beautiful example of what you're talking about. And the example I have in mind is the history of Visa, the company Visa, which grew out of the Bank Americard. And the person responsible for it was a man named D. Hock. And D. Hock, he's the author of a book called The Birth of the Chaotic Age. He was tasked with creating Visa. He was given some resources by Bank of America, and he suggested that he would take this job on only if he was allowed to do it his way. And they said, okay. And his way was he eliminated all management. There were no managers in his company. When Visa was first conceived and built, there was no management structure. It was completely horizontal. And people were able to join the business if they could find a niche where they could contribute.
Wow, that's ironic. That's ironic, dude. Because I mean, the Visa that exists today is
different.
Is not that.
No,
it's not that at all.
It's been corrupted.
What happened was, within 3 years, Visa became the company worldwide receiving the highest revenue of all the companies in the world. It got the highest annual revenue in 3 years from its inception. Whereupon it got bought out by a hierarchy that destroyed the culture that made it so successful in the first place. So Visa today, as you pointed out, it's not like that.
No, it's not.
Had they not sold it out to a hierarchy, it might still be today the most successful, because it amplified creativity at a most fundamental level in each and every person that was involved in it. It was a really magnificent undertaking, and it's described quite adequately in The Birth of the Chaotic Age by D. Huck.
Wow,
So
I did not know that. And
I hold it up as an example of the way the world could be.
I worked in the security industry for years, and Visa and MasterCard and the others were, of course, our customers, because they spend vast amounts of money on information security and unsurprisingly lose millions and millions of dollars every year, and nobody gets anything but raises for it, which is strange and interesting to me all by itself. But anyway, I had no idea that that was the genesis of Visa, and I had spent a lot of time in Visa facilities. So that's interesting.
Yes, that's widely known.
I want to keep this moving forward because we got a limited amount of time. But one of the things that's pointed out in this this Toyota Kata lean management video that I will link in the footnotes in regard to this, but is kind of a process that each individual person within the culture goes through, and they talk about 4 things. One is a daily practice. 2 is the kata, or the routine that they go through. 3 is coaching, and in regard to coaching, specifically talking about the process, like a coach that works on like karate moves or stuff like that. You've got to be really particular about the actual process. And then finally is mastery. And this is a process that continues over and over again. But what are your guys' thoughts in regard to that, and how the average people tackle their lives in their community and so forth?
Well, I have a lot to say on it, but I'll let Bob start.
Well, you've heard the expression, the random walk. I think most businesses are run today based on the random walk strategy, which is to say they don't do those things. There is no daily practice. There are no kata. The coaching is ineffective, and nobody achieves mastery. I mean, that's typical in the world as I see it anyway. So I think that those are useful disciplines, and they're probably not the ones that I would focus on if I were making suggestions to a big team, but they're a lot better than the absence of them. I think that they represent a big improvement over traditional management.
That's definitely true.
How about you, Kent, with the scrums and stuff like that? I'm sure this is
yeah, the context.
areas that.
Yeah, definitely. The context, I do want to put this in context. I really like being handed broken products, right? And it's sort of why I like working in mergers and acquisitions, is that, and working for PE firms. They have a bad name, but it's fun to fix something. The company wouldn't have got off the ground if it didn't have a good idea in the first place, right? So, I mean, the Visa example is spectacular, right? Because, at some point, Visa, because it's not going to last forever, at some point it's going to be an economic mess, and someone's going to have to turn it around. And I'll bet you one thing that'll work is taking it back to its principles, which will mean that it'll have to lose most of the people there because they are conforming to a different set of standards, so to speak, right? But anyway, I worked for this one company, Tripwire, and they had made an acquisition of a product that's used by the Verizon. I don't know if you've heard of Verizon. They have their security operations center, so they use it. It's a pretty important piece of software. But anyway, the idea is that they would buy it, put their name on it, sell it. So we sold it to 700-800 of our customers, and the thing just died, right? And the important thing about this story is that these people are being fined more per day than they probably spent on the software, so they were livid, right? And so I was made responsible, and the salespeople just stopped talking to their people, and so I made a lot of trips. I got yelled at by a lot of people, but I know how to fix it, right? And in that context, I can't go to the exec team and get more money. They're not going to give more money to a broken project, right? And so you got to make do with what you've got. And so, what I do is that I do 1 or 2 week sprints, which means that we release things on a regular basis like clockwork. and also don't release something unless it has value to the customer. And then we meet every day for 15 minutes, daily practice, just to make sure that what we're doing is the right thing to do. In fact, these sticky notes, for instance, I write. You can see it on the boards behind me. I do, every day about 3 things per day, just to do those well, right? And every day we check in and say, did we do what we said we were going to do? Yesterday we said we would do these 3 things. Did we do them? Yes or no? If not, what do we need to do to make sure that we've got resources allocated to make it happen? Or is the task too large, right? So it's every single day. At the end of every week, we have a review to check in what we're doing. And at the end of each sprint, at the end of each release, we do a brutally honest retrospective to find out what things are unnecessary, what things are needed to improve, et cetera. We make modifications to the process, and we improve and we improve and we improve. And all of this is done in the context of a broader strategic plan. Actually, I've got this on the board. I've got my 5-year, 3-year, 1-year plan right behind me. So, are the things that we're doing in alignment with the strategic practice? And man, just like that, you've got the strategic to tactical plan with a daily practice that's tied into a continuous process improvement that really doesn't require management. I just love that part, right? So, I mean, you can see why management will give a lip service to these practices, but it renders them not relevant in a hurry, right? So, yeah, and I could talk for hours about how this works, but don't need to because it's so succinct, it just works, right?
Amen.
Yeah, well, I think this is something that I think most entrepreneurs and business people, because they're so busy and so forth and so wrapped up in so many different things, they really never take the time to think about how this could work better for them. But then also in regard to living in society, you're basically subject to who you can drum up as far as people to work for you, instead of actually developing a culture of a community that could function in a way that you kind of create the principles that everybody agrees to right from the beginning, so that then all kinds of different businesses are adopting the same kind of principles, and you're getting people moving into what their expertises are and so forth.
Right.
One of the things that you pointed out to me, Kent, in regard to something that you have as an organizational model, is kind of a, I don't know, is it 7 steps to your organizational model in regards
I call them
to,
phases. I call them phases, or they're different milestones within what's like a maturity model, if you will. Like, and you and I have talked a lot about it. Outrage being the first, of course, and it's a great way of finding out where are people. If they're outraged, they're not really doing anything but emoting about how upset they are. And it's not a bad reason. They probably have perfectly good reason to be upset. In fact, it probably is why they're sitting in that meeting in the first place, talking to you about a volunteer effort. But man, I only got so much time to listen to people bitch about shit. So excuse my language.
Yeah, well, this is what I want to point out in regard to a way to kind of connect people from where they are now into why this is a good idea, is if they're outraged, and I hear outrage all the time in regard to all the different things that are going wrong, whether it's in people's businesses or in people's, their regular life, or in regard to the government or anything else. Mm-hmm. Outrage is just step 1, is the key thing here, and it's not, the thing that we could just dwell upon and everybody agree upon and get everybody to convince that, yeah, this is the thing that we should all be outraged about. It's for the individual to be outraged, but then that's to take the step 2, which is go to the next step, which is, I think, vision, right? In your case, in your model.
Yeah, well, the genesis of this model is that I had done skateboard advocacy since the 80s, actually, and I realized I had this foolish and kind of painfully embarrassing period where I thought that if we could become articulate, we could become eloquent about what we wanted, the city would listen to us. And I realized that we aren't players. We don't bring votes. We don't bring money. We're nobodies, right? So I had to learn, and fortunately I received a lot of guidance from people who had cut their teeth during the civil rights era, and they learned a lot about the brutal reality of politics. Is it's basically whoever has the most money and influence gets to make prioritization statements, right? So anyway, I learned a lot about that. And you fast forward a couple decades after, I used to run a nonprofit that taught grassroots advocates how to be effective, and I was on the board of the Tony Hawk Foundation. And so I learned that there's certain phases, if you will. And I learned that because I would ask the people who were responsible for these successful advocacies, I'd say, I want to see your binders. They'd send me a binder because they always had a binder. And it had all the letters they'd written and the clippings in the newspaper, but they fall into a certain chronology, if you will, right? So the first one is outrage. They're upset. Something's happened. There's a guy named Eric Menzer, whose son, Reed Menzer, was killed by a driver. And that's what got Eric off his ass, right? Because his kid died. He was really upset. That's outrage, right? But it ain't going to go anywhere. Outrage all by itself is nothing. And Eric actually had enough wisdom to realize that he's going to need to turn that into a vision, what enables him to engage other people and make them part of the process. And that requires some creativity. You got to come up with a solution. You can't talk about, this is awful and we need to fix it. You got to talk about what that means. And you got to make it really easy for other people to understand. And that's the second step. The third one is advocacy. You got to build your team, because even though you might be capable of superhuman feats of labor, you're not going to do it yourself, because you're going to get sick, or you know, something happens or whatever. So that's actually the genesis of your governance model. Who is going to work with you to make this happen? And you know, the fourth one is you know, fundraising. Can you go out and find the funding to get it happen? And then you know, you do design after that, and then you build it, and then you go into stewardship. So, you know, that's the chronology, and pretty much all of these successful efforts reflect that. And that's great in academic, but how to do that is that if you come at it from a hierarchy perspective, it ain't going to work, right? In fact, I'm actually assisting with grassroots advocates from the homeless community, people who are literally homeless, helping them be effective advocates. And I tell them, all you need is 3. You just got to meet every day. You got to agree to the 2 or 3 things you're going to do today, and you just go, 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 go. And those little steps will change the world, and it doesn't take much resources, you know.
Yeah, it's certainly adapting a daily habit and creating daily habits that make things happen. The little things always end up working out to the bigger things.
Right.
It's certainly understanding how to get the big vision into daily habits. But I know, you know, we're on the time frame here, so I'm going to have to touch on another thing. And that was a second video that I put out, which was the 5 dysfunctions of team. And this is one in which I'm going to point to Bob, but there's 5 different things that really most teams fall apart. And, you know, I see it just every freaking day, and damn near every business, every project, everything that we see, you know, especially on the crypto world, a lot of the projects, you see all the hardships and conflict and stuff going on, people, you know, stabbing each other in the back and all this kind of stuff. And, you know, there's really 5 elements. You know, there's trust, or having a trusting environment, or distrusting environment, having a environment in which people are afraid to have conflict, or can actually have healthy conflict, an area that is commitment, that people are actually committed to a goal. The 4th is peer-to-peer accountability, where each team member or each member of the group holds each other accountable for what they do. And then finally is just a focus on the results of the actual community. And so the biggest of those is really trust. And that's really the foundation of all the others. And this is an area that Bob, I think, can speak on. How do we build trust?
Well, of those 5 issues, and by the way, I really liked the little video, there are 3 of them that are very closely linked to each other. And that's the trust, the healthy conflict, and the peer-to-peer accountability. Those three things require a certain level or quality of communication among the participants. And the trust is the foundation. Unless we trust one another, that peer-to-peer accountability can't happen, and the healthy conflict can't happen. Trust comes first. And we develop trust by experiencing it. And there are lots of exercises that can be done in a group to build trust. And it works best in relatively small groups, no big surprise there. I've worked with groups up to about a dozen people very effectively to build trust in an environment where the trust doesn't exist at the beginning. You can take 8 or 10 or 12 strangers, put them in a room with an agenda and some coaching, and over a period of time, they will become highly trusting of each other, able to engage in healthy conflict, and to hold each other accountable. So I'm absolutely in favor of those organizational processes that enhance that trust. And you know, if anyone's looking for information about it, I have many years of experience working with groups on those very issues.
There's an additional thing, Bob, I'd love to hear you talk about, which I think is actually related. The trust thing you said is going to require a little bit of faith, right? Which means that you're going to have to let go and see what your team does with it. And that is where a lot of teams fall apart, is that they don't trust and they start to sabotage the efforts of others without just sort of letting them happen. And, you know, I'm a parent, I got 5 kids, and sometimes you just got to let things fail because then you learn through it, and which is okay. It's not catastrophe, right? But this dovetails into some of the what I consider spectacular work around creativity. You know what I'm talking about? The you know, the biggest limitation, the way I would paraphrase your work is that the greatest limitation to that pure creativity is how honest people can be with themselves. Because frequently they're so busy, they're so scared to fail. They start blame shifting and accusing others where they shouldn't just be honest with themselves, right? So I'd love to hear you talk about that. I know we're short on time, but I think it's pretty important.
I think it's the biggest handicap that humans have, is that as infants and toddlers, we are very, very susceptible to what to adults would seem like almost trivial traumas. And as we're traumatized, our parents, for lack of understanding, don't know frequently that they're traumatizing us, have no idea what the consequences are of that. And because of that, we tend to develop amnesia for those formative years. And so we don't actually know who we are or how we got to be who we are. And it is that lack of self-awareness that sets us up for all kinds of failure in terms of our growth. Most adults walking around today are physically and mentally adults and emotionally children. They have their emotional development got arrested when they were little, stopped. So I totally agree with you that in order for us to trust each other, we have to know ourselves. Mm-hmm. We have to have a deep understanding of who am I and how did I get to be who I am? What were the influences that made me who I am? And it doesn't take 10 years of therapy to learn that stuff, the basic stuff. 6 months to a year of once, a couple of hours a week for 6 months, and you have it nailed enough to be able to participate in healthy conflict and peer-to-peer accountability in a trusting environment. And my focus for the last several years has been figuring out what is the most efficient way I can to bring that about in a group. And again, it's part of this thing I call sociopolycentric stewardship, or SPS. And it can be brought into a business environment, into an academic environment, into any group environment that has ethical purpose. One can introduce this technology because it does exactly what you've been talking about. It creates that kind of trust and the kind of dynamics that make management superfluous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it requires the honesty. I can't speak to it enough. It's actually why I go out of my way to hire. I've got 2 women that work in my exec team that are in their 60s, and man, ain't nothing I can do to try to manipulate their favor. They're going to be brutally honest with me. They're not cruel, but they're direct, right? And so they're unafraid to say, Kent, that's from a place of ego, and you need to tap the brakes. And I'm like, okay, well, and the other thing I do is actually give them equity. So it's their company. And they've raised children to adults, and they're just not dissuaded by any of my charm or any of that other stuff. And so that's sort of a trick that I've gone through to try to do that. It's not comfortable. It's in fact by design uncomfortable, because discomfort is how you learn. If things are comfortable, it tells you that everything's working. So, you know, I have a lot of really candid, I'll get a phone call saying, hey, would you like to come over for chicken tonight? And I'm like, oh, here we go. It's like having a talk with my grandma. You know what I mean? But I mean, it's what we need to do. And I think that organizations need to have that kind of honesty. It's not cruelty. It's not being honest as a disguise for cruelty. It's being direct. It's being completely clear. But that means you have to look at yourself and say, you know what? That's right. That's totally right. That is me, you know?
Yeah, you're right. You got it.
Absolutely. I'm gonna read something here and you know, try and wrap this up with this final conclusion, and that is a quote from Aldous Huxley from 1961. What he said is, "There will be in the next generation or so a pharmacological method of making people love their servitude and producing dictatorship without tears, so to speak, producing a kind of painless concentration camp for entire societies, so that people will in fact have their liberties taken away from them, but will rather enjoy it because they will be distracted from any desire to rebel by propaganda or brainwashing enhanced by pharmacological methods. And this seems to be the final revolution." I think what he's talking about is what we see today in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And this is kind of what I think would be the typical person in society is really within the realm of. They don't really see what the problem is. But for those that do see, how do they combat this? And how do they, you know, create the circumstance and create a culture outside of this societal culture that can give them the opportunity to really rejuvenate their own humanity and start to regain that freedom of the mindset and the ability to deal with other people that allows them to really prosper. You know, I think this is the thing that people don't realize is how much they're giving away. But
Right.
I'll let each of you comment on that.
Well, I mean, I think that most people that are at least marginally conscious are aware of the fact that their government has participated in pedophilia, right? That's a really blunt example. And at the same time, they're like, I don't know what to do about it. I'm just so busy with everyday life, and I know it's bad, but if we just vote these guys in, it'll all change, even though they know consciously it ain't going to work. You know what I mean? So that's a really simple and great example of it. I mean, how many people, if they were going to be completely honest with themselves, would look in the mirror and say, I'm essentially endorsing pedophilia, right? Just to use the Epstein example, right? And at the same time, the inaction is amazing to me. And I have a belief that that's not going to stay. That won't be steady state. It'll change. And there will be those who will kick themselves for not having demonstrated the courage to do the right thing, even though it was not popular, right?
I see an even bigger example, and that is mass murder. Millions of people slaughtered in wars, millions of people slaughtered in democide, that is, governments killing their own people. I think that's an even bigger, more obvious example than the pedophilia, because pedophilia has been hidden from the public for so long.
Right.
But war has not. War has been out there in our face every day for decades and decades, maybe for hundreds of years if you think it through. And yet people are accepting of it. It's like, oh, well, there's nothing I can do about that. That's government making those decisions, and they're wise and they're going to do the right thing, which is bullshit.
Right. It's our team versus their team. It's Steelers versus the Cowboys is how people treat it.
Yes, exactly. Without understanding until it comes home to them that we're talking about millions of lives being either slaughtered literally or ruined financially or otherwise. And the system that has been doing this is in crisis itself. We are on the brink of that whole system collapsing. And I am writing an article about what I'm predicting is going to be the outcome of that, because I see that we're all going to be affected by what happens in the next 6 months to a year. And I'm not talking about a cataclysm that'll happen 10 years from now. The cataclysm has already begun, and we're all sitting around on the sidelines of it as people are being slaughtered. People are being killed and mass murdered by their own governments in the United States, in Europe, in the entire Western world, if not in the whole world generally. So I have very strong feelings about what's going on. And I do see that it is this blindness to what's going on around us that comes directly out of our refusal to know who we are, to understand our own craziness, our own insanities that are drummed into us from birth. So yes, I'm hoping to.
Well,
Go ahead.
Just to add to that, Bob, one of the other things that all this says in this particular presentation is that, there are ways to deepen the conditioning, to deepen the programming. And he talks about like giving lack of sleep, creating stressful situations, malnutrition, illness. All these things can deepen the conditioning that's going on. And so these things are all things that people can see are happening. People are driving themselves insane with the computers and stuff like that. So they're up at 3 o'clock in the morning. They got to get up at 6. They're lacking sleep. But when they're doing that, they're also creating the circumstance where the brain is incapable of really seeing what they're doing to them.
Yeah.
They're
Right.
conditioned,
Okay.
and they don't even realize it.
But I got a message
Go
of
ahead.
hope on this one. I got a message on hope on this one. Then it actually comes from the private sector. If you're a small company and you think that you have a technology that will eventually disrupt the large incumbent players, if you are, for instance, a cryptocurrency that thinks that you could eventually topple the primacy of Visa and other monetary systems and all that, right? You don't go head to head with them. You go to areas where it's not economically feasible for the big guys to compete, right? And that's why you begin with niche markets, and that is just how it's done. And the reason this works is that there might be somebody within that large company who recognizes that this is an existential threat long term. You can't make a financial justification for fighting it because that's a byproduct of centralized institutions, right? They can't put it together. So this is the cool thing is that I believe that our economic system is in a state of duress, basically because of superfluous management and overhead, right? That's like basically it. And in those pools of unaccountability are the inevitable examples of graft, waste, abuse, fraud that basically just continues to gobble up money that could be spent elsewhere. And they're just going to keep on doing what they're doing, right? So we actually have an opportunity to do things at the small level because it's not economically feasible for them to do it there anyway, right? There might be somebody who recognizes that they're as an emerging existential threat, but they don't have a financial justification to pursue it. And so my point is that if people can focus on their own communities, start with 3 people, maybe scale up to 5. If there's more than that, put together another group, right? And you can actually do this. And I'm pretty sure that you could actually start putting together solutions that are better than what the centralized institutions are. You're developing a competitive model, and then people can choose what actually is better for them. And so and that's encouraging because then it's not like, oh, I can't do anything and I have no power. That's not technically true. You have all kinds of power. You just choose where you're going to put it, right? Are you going to continue rooting for the Steelers versus the Cowboys, which is basically, one group killing another group at our expense? Or are you going to actually start putting something together for your community? You get to choose, pick your adventure, right?
Amen.
Well, and it's also about creating a community where people can draw upon that.
Yes.
Draw upon the understanding, to where entrepreneurs and business people and stuff, they can utilize that community because they see that as a resource. and you know, they see each individual within the community as potential resources that they can inject into their business and have a more, you know, pertinent outcome. So it is a, you know, a path to like expanding it up into this amazing explosion, which I think is really kind of outlined in a book called The Discovery of Freedom. You know, we were 8,000 years of civilization or whatever, that, you know, we still had a horse and buggy from the beginning to the end of that. And then in 200 years, with, you know, a few different things that came about in regard to the colonial period of the United States, is really this really key moment where some key things happened, that people started to actually believe in themselves and had enough freedom to do whatever they wanted, and a community of people around that said, yeah, that's a good idea, that this explosion happened, and that an amazing amount of technology was released, and an amazing amount of quality of living was released, that, you know, they're trying to put it back in the box now, you know.
Right.
And we've got the opportunity to really kind of create the circumstances that we can create a system, and we can work together with each other to do something that totally thwarts what the bigger governments and society and bankers and all those other bad people are trying to do. We don't have to get an elected official to agree with us. We just agree amongst ourselves,
Right.
and start doing something different that
Right.
works. And I guess I'll leave it with there. Has anybody got any other final words? Because I know you got to get going, Kent. So
No, this has been a productive conversation, and it is definitely a topic that's up my alley. Is that it's possible. I mean, a lot of this might be theory to people, but it's not actually. This happens. This is doable. You're not helpless, right?
Some of us are doing it.
That's exactly right. Yep. Yeah, just ask us how.
There you go.
exactly.
Right.
All right, gentlemen, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for taking the time. We will talk again soon, I'm sure.